Thanks to Dimitri for the invitation, and Randy, of course, my friend Randy, and for Emily for her administrative support. Excellent. So I'm very sorry I'm not there in person, but in the week leading up, last week, the Australian government sent me new advisories on travel to the US. And I just made the decision that I'm a person who believes that COVID is a dangerous illness, and I don't intend to catch it. No, so if I had have ignored that Australian government advice, I'd be on my own, and if I got sick, and long journey and all of that. So thanks for your tolerance in accepting this less than perfect way of communicating, and I was looking forward to seeing my friends and Randy and Pavlina and gang, and so it's a bit disappointing, but we'll do our best. And I'm just not sure how you've been running these sessions, but it's a 90-minute session as I understand, and I don't think we want to be attentive for 90 minutes, so I'm proposing that I'll talk. I'm quite happy to take interventions, but remember, interventions slow down the delivery a bit. But I'm quite happy to, I think I should just talk for a time, and then we'll have a little break, a few minutes just to walk a bit for me. And not that there's anyone to walk to in the middle of the night in my office. So, and then I'm happy to spend at least half an hour maybe discussing things in more detail. Okay, so the topic of today, and I'll be back again early tomorrow for me, but a bit later in the afternoon for you. So the topic today is buffer stocks. Now I've got a few slides. One of the things our educational technologists have found in their research over the last few years is that slides are out. You shouldn't be using too many slides, both in live context, but also definitely via Zoom. The last thing that audiences, they just switch off after apparently 32 minutes is the go to sleep point. So I've got a few slides because there's just a few a diagram that will help me explain something. But other than that, no slides, it's just a narrative. And, you know, it's common in the humanities just to have narratives. So the topic is central to modern monetary theory. I believe it's one of our innovations. So a lot of what we now aggregate under modern monetary theory is derivative. I mean, all ideas are derivative, really, aren't they, when you think about it? But they're putting together pieces from here, there, and everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but here and there, and building them into a coherent framework that's commensurate and applicable to a fiat currency system. But there are some things that we came up with that I believe aren't derivative within the economic tradition. And I think the concept of buffer stocks within a Phillips curve environment and an inflation theory environment is really one of the things that you could say is less derivative. And the other thing that I hope we get out of this is a clear understanding of the provenance of this idea within MMT. And I'm talking now about job guarantee. Because what's happened, and I can't control it, is that the unfolding of ideas as people become familiar with MMT, at least in their view, and start extemporizing themselves as to what it all means, is that you get further away from the original idea in some cases. Not always, not often maybe, but sometimes you do, and in this case you do. And you know, I read things on social media. I try to steer clear of it as much as I can, but I do read it, and I get sent emails, and you know, stacks of emails every day about, oh, the job guarantee is going to solve the Green New Deal. All of the employment dislocation from the Green New Deal. Well, we've got the job guarantee, no worries. Well, wrong. And the job guarantee had a very special provenance. And I'll talk about that, and it'll help you understand why those who say now even that, well, we've got this inflationary episode, job guarantee will help. Well, it would be very an undesirable policy path to pursue at the moment. And for those on the other side who are not supportive, who say, oh yeah, these idiots, these Moslem, Mitchell and Ray and these characters, you know, they've been batting on for years about a job guarantee, and look, you know, even if you had one, it wouldn't stop inflation at the moment. And that's true. But the mistake they make is in thinking that we think it would. So that's what I want to talk about, those things a bit, but we'll go back to basics. So the evolution of the idea of why did I start writing about buffer stocks? And you know, I became into, I hate microeconomics. When I was a student, I thought it was, I'd done mathematics and mathematical statistics. And I just thought that the maths that I was learning in undergrad micro was ridiculous. And I had, it was ridiculously simplistic, but also I had a moral repugnance to the whole concept of individualism, and because as well as doing maths and stats, I'd done philosophy and things like that, embedded very much in an arts tradition, with a technical arts tradition. And so I really didn't like micro. So the only thing for me to, if I thought I'd better study economics, because I thought this is in just after I started studying economics in the second half of the 1970s, and it was a massive period of global dislocation after the first OPEC oil crisis that began in October 1973. And so I'd been studying these humanities and art subjects and maths, and they're fascinating and like playing chess. But the only game I've got on my computer is on my phone is chess. So all these things, yeah, fascinating. But at the time, it was right at the heart of the beginning of what we now think of neoliberal era. And unemployment in Australia was rising quite dramatically. It had been below 2% since the end of the Second World War, and suddenly it was rising to 4 or 5, and got higher later in the 70s. So we had the start of the stagflation period, and as a consequence, I thought, well, I better just rejig my studies and study economics, because I thought, well, as a young Marxian type progressive person battling this system, I thought I'd better have some tools and I thought that economics was going to be the main game for where the contest would be, on how we construct our government to do stuff that enhances our well-being and returns us to a period, if not as a interregnum, where we could get the state to be a mediator between class conflict between labour and capital rather than an agent for capital, as it appeared was happening in the mid-70s. Government was moving away from being a mediator in that conflict, but to being an active support of capital. And I hated that, of course. And so I thought I'd study economics. Micro didn't appeal at all. I had to do it, of course. We all had to do it right through to graduate school. But I became fascinated with macro. And the abstraction of macro was very interesting to me. The idea that none of these, you know, the inflation rate doesn't actually exist, and it's just a construction, and all the problems, the mathematical problems of aggregation and all of that became very fascinating to me, and growth theory and capital theory and those type of things. And so I obviously then became very interested, because by the time I was getting into the later parts of undergrad, inflation in Australia was very high. Unemployment had risen. We had a really full-blown stagflation. And the whole debate was about was being conducted within the Phillips curve framework. And the whole debate was about, and remember in 1975, Modigliani and Papademos published their Nehru paper, which really sort of popularised the natural rate theories of Friedman in 1968 and 60, and Phelps in 67, 68. And all the discussion was, well, what's the natural rate? You know, what's the Nehru? And you had these jerks coming out in, you know, my econometric peers coming out and estimating Nehrus that were rising and rising. And then when you looked at their standard errors, they'd have standard errors, you know, they might have a Nehru rising from 4% to 8%, but a standard error of 2% to 14% or something. And, you know, I just looked at the technical sides of that and thought, I won't say what I thought. It just seemed a ludicrous manipulation of technical tools to support an ideology that was pernicious against workers. And so, you know, and by then Phillips's original 58 contribution, which really wasn't the first Phillips curve, by the way, and if you ever want to read my PhD, I trace all that through, but Phillips had been overtaken by Friedman and Phelps. The expectations augmented Phillips curve. And then some of the loonies in the, you know, the real hardcore loonies, Sargent and Wallace and these characters. And they had gone even further and, you know, even eliminated short run trade-off possibilities. And so you had all this talk about disinflation and the need to push unemployment up for a time to expel expectations. And I remember I saw a TV program where Milton Friedman was in Australia. And I might be conflating programs, but I remember I heard him asked, well, how long will a typical disinflationary episode? This is when central banks push interest rates up and target, you know, money targeting was still in vogue at that stage. How long might it take to disinflate? How long will unemployment have to be elevated above the Nehru? And you know, academic economists never got their hands dirty with detail like that, did they? But Friedman was honest. He said, oh, probably more than 15 years. You think about that. These guys, this is a professor from University of Chicago, saying that you have to have deliberately enforced elevated levels of unemployment for more than 15 years. That's, you know, a generation to deflate the economy. And I just thought, as a young student, I thought this is beyond the pale. I've got to do something about this. And so by the time I got into, and this period, of course, was also the beginning of the deficit manias, the fetishes against deficits, the abandonment of full employment, the use of unemployment as a policy tool rather than a policy target. So we had a paradigm shift in this period. And so, you might think about it as a young student, it's a very fascinating period to be a part of a paradigm shift. And what I learned from that was that paradigms do shift. And that's always given me hope that we can shift it again. Haven't done it yet, but here we are. And so my mission became a technical one, really, apart from narrative, but a technical one to build a framework, put pieces of ideas together that would be a framework where I could contest these ideas that the Nehru had risen, and that the way in which the Phillips curve now, the dynamics of the Phillips curve, rendered fiscal intervention dangerous, and the policy assignment should shift to monetary policy. And on every level, that was offensive to me. That you've got these technocrats who are unaccountable, who are going to just sort of hold interest rates at such levels that for 15 years, blah, blah. That you've got our elected representatives actually undermining our well-being by pursuing fiscal surpluses and destroying growth in spending in public sector, in hospitals, schools, whatever. And so I set about working a framework, and that was really began in my 4th year at university, which in Australia, we have a British system, and the 4th year is called the honours year. So if you get a certain good result in your undergraduate average, then you can go and do a 4th year. And really the 4th year, the honours year, is the precursor to going then on to masters and then PhD. And at that one of the coursework units I had to do on there was an agricultural economics subject. And in the depths of winter, which is not really anything you would identify as winter, I was sitting in a lecture theatre and we were getting a lecture on the wool price stabilisation scheme. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I wasn't so much interested in wool, but I was certainly interested in the rising unemployment at the time. And what I did was I identified that what I was learning as part of this agricultural course was transportable into labour economics, into macro labour. And I thought about it, and I reconfigured the price stabilisation scheme for farmers as a full employment scheme for workers. And I reconfigured my term paper that in that subject was also a reconfiguring of the Phillips curve. And one of the things that I learned from that particular, and I'll tell you in more detail in a sec, but one of the things that became then very obvious to me was that the currency user, the government, the currency issuer, the government, can discipline the aggregate price level ultimately by the price it pays for things itself. And in this case, it became very obvious that to me at that stage, 1978 this is, that if the government ran a buffer stock employment program, and whatever price it paid for the labour that moved into that program would ultimately discipline the price level. Now, ultimately is the important qualification, because it could be quite a costly, in real terms, exercise in getting to the state where that discipline was binding. I'll talk about that again soon. And the other part of the other element of my mission that I began with was all of the talk at that time about the Phillips curve was, there was a battle between the Keynesians who were losing out and the monetarists who had taken over the joint. And these were like, the barbarians from the wild that come into our academy and taken over the joint. But the debate, the Phillips curve was all conducted within this Phillips curve framework, which is really interesting to me. And the debate at that time was, well, what's the size of the coefficient on the expectation, the inflationary expectations term in the expectations augmented Phillips curve? Because if it was 1, if the econometric estimates said it was 1 or within a standard error of 1, the standard interval had 1 in it, then the Phillips curve would shift to vertical very quickly. And so Keynesians were, sitting back there, getting sucked into this debate and desperate to use any econometric fudge that they could to get an estimate below 1. Because if it was 0.6 or 0.7, well, then you did get a short-term trade-off within that framework, and the adjustment would be multi-period and slower. So the government could exploit the traditional Phillips curve. Now, I thought about that and I said, there was an article not long after that called Let's Take the Con Out of Econometrics. Now, I'm an econometrician, I like it, and I've done a lot of it, but I thought this was a pretty moribund debate for progressives to get involved in, because it was very hard to get an estimate of a coefficient in an aggregate equation like that, using aggregate data like that, that didn't include a point within the confidence interval close to 1. And so my mission then was to go back to the coefficient on the unemployment term and examine whether there was what we call now hysteresis. And my first paper on that actually came out. I wrote that. This is a bit after in history now, by the way. This is once I became an academic, but one of my first papers was on hysteresis and showing that there is cyclicality in any estimate of that you call structural within a Phillips curve on the unemployment term. And what that meant was, of course, that what looks like a rising NAIRU in a statistical sense is not actually, it goes away once you inflate the economy again. You use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy again. Now, that was a very important part of what I'm talking about tonight, buffer stocks as well. But it was just my second prong of my so-called one person attack on monetarism. And the interesting side of that was that the paper I wrote was written well before, and the model I estimated was written well before Blanchard and Summers' paper came out in '87. But they got the credit. Mine was held up in refereeing processes with a journal for 2 years or something. So they got the credit for hysteresis, and so be it. But at least it got out there. So let's get into this slide. the way the wool price stabilisation scheme worked, and now I'm just talking about the mechanics of buffer stock, so you know what we're talking about, is that, and here's a picture. These old red brick buildings. This is an old photo, but these big red brick, multi-level red brick buildings were all around our cities in Australia. They were built by pastoral companies and federal governments and state governments, and they held wool. Now, what happened was the wool price stabilisation scheme was introduced by the federal government under extreme pressure from the farming lobby, the wool growers. Australia's one of the huge dependence at that time on wool exports, and our wool's very high quality and all of that stuff. But like all rural lobbies, they have disproportionate influence on the political process and resource allocation. And so the farmers had convinced the federal government, and the problem for them, of course, also was the extreme fluctuations in their farm income, you know, one year to the next. You have a good year and a bad year, and you know, there used to be jokes that in the good years there'd be lots of Mercedes-Benzes bought by farmers, and then lots of foreclosures in the bad years. And so it became a sensible proposition to have a scheme that would stabilise their income over a longer period so that they had more investment certainty and that there was some buffer to absorb their losses and return their excess gains, take their excess gains back. So here's how it works. This is just a demand and supply. I hate micro, but this is a demand and supply structure. So each year the farmers have their sheep running around and they clip them, and the clip goes to the market, and that's commodity supply. And it's probably a very inelastic curve because they've got all left. They're not going to sort of not shear sheep just because the price is slightly different up or down, or they shear all their sheep and they take the wool to the market. So that's a volume. Price is on the vertical axis. So in this first situation, the market demand, which is D1, and the dotted line is the price guarantee that the federal government gave the farmers as part of this stabilisation scheme. And so in this first diagram, the market demand is exactly equal to supply, and so the price guarantee is met by market processes. So there's no intervention from the government. Now have a look what happens when demand falls. So in the second year, the clip is the same, and the demand for the clip for wool in that year is much less. And so suddenly you've got an excess supply of AB at the guaranteed price. Now, if it was a pure market system, agricultural market system, the price would fall from B vertically downwards, of course. And so the price guarantee, and that was the typical thing that happened before the scheme. So that red area is the government buying the wool in the market, becoming a component of demand for wool, and ensuring that the price guarantee is sustained. So the farmers sell all their clip. It's just that the government buys the red area now rather than the private wool buyers. And that red amount then gets stored in those red brick buildings. So now take the opposite case. So in one year, some year, suddenly everyone loves wool the clip goes to the market, the wool demand is D3. And so you've now got at the guaranteed price, you've got an excess demand of BC. And if the market was just doing stuff, the price would rise vertically above B, which was the old way that happened. And the farmers would get really flush with income and go and buy all those Mercedes Benzes. But under the wool price stabilisation scheme, the government would sell wool equivalent to that blue area, sell wool into the market. So the supply then becomes the farm clip plus the stocks coming out of the wool stores. And that became a price stabilisation method. Now the problem, there were many problems with the scheme. Some of them were not problems, but they were seen as problems because there was all this, we were in an era where people were getting increasingly fetished about fiscal deficits. And of course, when the government was buying up wool, it was spending and using government spending above taxation to in part to buy the wool. And so that, all the conservatives were saying this is outrageous, running deficits, etc. But the other big problem was that the farmers got greedy. The National Farmers Federation and the lobby groups for the rural sectors became greedy. And increasingly, they pressured the federal government to push the guarantee up and up, higher and higher. And so we got this situation where the original price guarantee well below the new price guarantee. And I put in a historically high demand curve there. Of course, wool demand fluctuates quite dramatically each market period. But, that's a high one. That's sort of like, it doesn't get much higher than that. And so what happened as a consequence of this is that the system became biased continually to the government being a buyer rather than a seller. And so the wool clip had come in, and the government would be having to buy to meet this elevated price guarantee. The government would just be continually buying wool. And I'll show you a photo. That's an old photo, but that's sort of what happened. And as a consequence, it just became a ridiculous system. It became a subsidy system where the farmers knew that if they flooded the market with a wool clip, they could sell it at this elevated guaranteed price. And so they just kept pushing the federal government through their lobbying to push the guarantee up. And that sort of allowed them to then expand their acreage, pull down more trees and devastate our environment, as we now know. And the government became increasingly under pressure because of the massive stockpiles of wool, which also started rotting because, wool deteriorates over time if it's stored in this way. And so that system was eventually abandoned. Now, when I note that often critics come out when they find the linkage between the stabilisation scheme and the job guarantee, they say, oh yeah, that idiot Mitchell, he's motivated by a system that was a massive failure. Excuse me. And I just laugh at that, of course, but as I do most of these critiques. I mean, at the most elementary level, think about workers' families are hardly going to go on a breeding boom to get a job guarantee job. Whereas the farmers had a direct incentive to produce more wool to get the guaranteed price because it expanded their income. Excuse me. All right, so that's how a buffer stock system works, and they're common in agricultural policy settings. So traditionally common, not so much now, but they've been regularly used in all sorts of different agricultural commodity markets to solve that problem of boom and bust. But as I was sitting as a student in 1978 in my fourth year at Melbourne University, it became apparent to me that this was, and I was looking out the window, daily reports of rising unemployment, and it became apparent to me that this was a full employment of wool scheme effectively, and that this would be a vehicle to return us to full employment of labour. But remember what I said about the context of where these ideas for me began. It wasn't just a full employment of labour scheme like a generalised Keynesian expansion. It was a specific scheme that addressed the inflationary issue that really, and I'll come back to that in a minute, that really killed the debate about the Phillips curve in my view. So then I realised and started to reconfigure my thinking and work to in the inflation space to characterise the problem as a choice between two buffer stock systems, an unemployment buffer stock system or an employment buffer stock system. Because what was the dominant system once monetarism had persuaded policymakers to abandon full employment and to convert mass unemployment from being our understanding of mass unemployment from being a systemic failure to create enough jobs to a exhibition of languid, idle behaviour of the unemployed, so from system to individual, blaming the victims, in other words. Once monetarism had persuaded us all that full employment didn't exist anymore, and the target really was the Nehru now, and that could be anywhere between 2 and 15% or whatever. And the deviations from the Nehru were going to be, could be more than 15 years of harsh policy to get back to your Nehru. The concept of an unemployment buffer stock became dominant. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the hysteresis part of the work I mentioned before was to question this idea of a static Nehru. And of course, once you've got hysteretic properties in the labour market, then you can write out a mathematical model and estimate it that shows that there is no stable Nehru. And of course, later on, the monetarists realised that they had to cope with that. And so you got this varying Nehru, but it was bunk anyway. And the other important part is to understand the unemployment buffer stock. I realised that you had to have a very deep idea of what was driving the inflation in the first place. Why did an unemployment buffer stock actually work to discipline inflation? Was it just an excess demand story? And I realised, and in the late 60s, a lot of Marxist scholars had really brought together strands of literature that created or introduced the idea of conflict theory of inflation. That inflation was really the product of a distributional struggle over real income, over nominal income for real income shares, and that it was embedded, of course, a distributional struggle was embedded in the sort of Marxian idea of class conflict, which of course appealed to me. Not the conflict, but the structure, the framework. And that you could get a shock to a steady state, and steady state doesn't mean market clearing or anything, it just means a moment of rest. You could have a moment of rest that was then shocked by, say, a raw material shock, say the doubling of oil price in the late 70s, late 73, early 74. And that shock would then come into a distributional system. So, and then that would trigger a brawl between capital and labour as to who was going to take the loss. And of course, that approach to understanding inflation really cut across demand pull and cost push and all of the other stuff that monetarists were on about, there's excessive monetary growth, etc. It really embedded the idea of inflation into the structure of the capitalist system. And that the reason unemployment buffer stocks were a way of attenuating that, not a very effective way, as I'll say, but was because they disciplined the aspirations of the price setters. So the price setters were trade unions pushing and setting and influencing wage rates, growth in wages, and adopting real wage resistance to ensure that they weren't going to take the real income losses. And on the other side, the price setters were the markup corporations, etc., who were defending their real margins by responding to real wage resistance by using their price setting power. And so if you scorch the earth by increasing mass unemployment, then eventually you discipline the aspirations of the workers. They become fearful that they'll be next. So they start moderating their employment, their wage demands. And you kill the product market, so you kill off sales, and that eventually leads to the corporations, the firms, going for market share rather than for margin push. And eventually, the wage price spiral, or the price wage spiral, or the wage price wage spiral, there were all different ways of describing depending on where the push started from. Eventually that abates, and the inflation gets resolved. And I mean, there was all this talk about it had to be a long-term process, because once the distributional conflict propagated the initial supply shock, for example, well, then expectations took over. And, the monetarists kept pushing this idea of the de-anchoring of expectations. And that took longer to achieve, apparently, than if they remained anchored. And, I mean, your macro probably, and that led to all the stuff about inflation targeting in the 90s, but that's not for that. just on unemployment buffer stocks, to me, it was unbelievable shift in policy because it was highly destructive, because it was massively inefficient. It actually took a long time to quell wage demands and corporations' desires for margin push. And in the meantime, you had daily GDP losses, depending on the scale of your economy, of millions or billions even. And at the same time, during this era, by the way, was all this talk about microeconomic efficiencies. And everyone became obsessed with microeconomic efficiencies, like making the trains run on a minute more precisely, or something like that. Yet at the same time, they were invoking austerity type policies that oversaw massive macroeconomic inefficiencies, massive output gaps, massive waste of labour, massive income losses. And because I was of a progressive bent, I was also concerned with, unlike most mainstream economists, I read literature in sociology and psychology and those type of other social science disciplines. And it was obvious that the impact upon psychological and health and impact upon the individual and their families of unemployment was diabolical. And I could name all the pathologies, increased alcohol and substance abuse, increased interaction with the criminal justice system, increased interaction with the health system, both psychological and physical, deterioration in health. And so, at primary school, you learn to do simple sums. Well, the simple sum to me at that stage was that this just couldn't possibly be the best way to intervene in the distributional conflict. I accepted that there was a battle of markups, a distributional conflict, but this couldn't be the best way to do it because it was just so destructive. And, around the same time, a bit earlier, but different countries embraced floating exchange rates at different times. But for me in Australia, we didn't float until 83. But the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system was 71, of course. Well, not quite 71. I mean, it was really not until Smithsonian had collapsed and Jamaica Accords came out in 75 that they really abandoned it. But so rocking along at the same time as all this inflation stuff was the fact that we entered the fiat currency system era, fiat monetary era. And what I was learning about that was that the need for fiscal policy to be financially constrained to provide support to the central banks in their quest to satisfy the conditions under Bretton Woods to stabilise exchange rates at agreed parities. Well, then the fiscal policy was no longer constrained in that way. And so putting all that together, that's how I came up with the idea of the job guarantee. I originally called it the buffer stock employment scheme. And then it was quite interesting because by 1994, 95, I was then an academic and that's what I was doing. And I met Warren Mosler and he had come up with, met him online, not on a dating site or anything, and met him online and in a discussion group, and he'd come up with a very similar price stabilisation system from first principles himself, and that really bonded us at the beginning. And then Randy came involved, and that was the original bonding. But essence of the employment buffer stock system is, go back to the wool price stabilisation framework, is that the government stands ready to buy any excess supply and has a system in the labour market, and that mechanism can immediately release when there's an excess demand. And that so you sort of solve the full employment problem. Now at the time, I forgot to, I originally called it the BSE, that's right, sorry, I missed that point. Then when Warren and I started working together with Randy in that, in Britain was the mad cow disease, which was called BSE. So it had to change, didn't it? It was already considered mad enough, so the job guarantee. So we eventually ended up calling it a job guarantee. But the important point is that catching back up again, is that the government spends on a price rule. So the price guarantee and the stabilisation scheme. And in this case, the a lot of fiscal expenditure is based upon a quantity rule of spending, where the government says, oh, we're going to spend $10 billion on education this year. And I don't know which country that would be, but when that runs out, that runs out. And it was quite obvious you couldn't have an employment buffer stock system like that. It had to be unconditional. The demand for labour under the scheme had to be perfectly elastic at a fixed price. And so the other essential characteristic of it was that it had to be at the bottom of the existing way of the other wage structure. I was about to say existing, but not necessarily. And what I mean by that is that when the program is to be introduced, the government effectively sets a new wage floor, a new minimum wage. Now, it could just set it below the existing wage floor if it believed that was suitable, or it could have an industry policy type element to it and set a new one and drive out some of those high cost, low productivity private sector firms. That's just all design issue. But once the wage is set, that the government will buy unlimited labour at, unconditional amounts of labour at, then that becomes the wage floor. And so what you've effectively got is a framework where the government can redistribute labour from, and this is really important to accentuate, can redistribute labour from the, let's say, the private sector, but it might be even government sector as well, standard government sector, which in an inflationary environment, thank you. In an inflationary environment, I'm nearly finished. In an inflationary environment, wage price spiral going on, inflation's going crazy, everyone's in it to defend their real share. The government then can redistribute using contractionary policy. Under unemployment buffer stock system, it goes into the unemployment. Under a job guarantee system, it goes into job guarantee. And so what effectively you're doing is redistributing workers from an inflating sector into a fixed price sector. And eventually, depending upon the elasticities, etc., you'll stabilise the price level again. Now, that's a really important thing to appreciate, because it's still not a very desirable solution. You're still forcing workers out of their jobs into other jobs rather than into unemployment. But at the time, when I came up with the idea, late 70s, it was a better of two bad options. And of course, my understanding and my background told me that for the working class in a capitalist system, there were always going to be devilish prospects, bad prospects. So until we mounted the barricades and collapsed the system, a better option than a worse option was better. Now that's why so my whole conception of a job guarantee was we should aim always to minimise it. We should never see it as a job creation vehicle alone. It's a macro stability framework, and that's why it's sort of a base component of MMT. And if there's productive things to be done, well, why would you put them in a socially inclusive minimum wage job? Just to create conventional public sector jobs. So when I see progressives who have become enthused about MMT talking as if our employment solution is job guarantee, it's not. That's a misunderstanding of the provenance of the concept and what the mechanism was meant to achieve, and can really only achieve. It's a last resort in a way. The last thing you want governments to be doing is destroying jobs in the broader economy. But sometimes, under particular circumstances, it has to do that. And so then you get the devil's choice. Should you have an unemployment buffer stock or an employment buffer stock? Well, it's hands down that the employment buffer stock is superior. A few other things, I'll go for about 5 or 6 more minutes and then I'll finish. It also became apparent to me that it was a very powerful automatic stabiliser. And at the time that I was developing this idea, there was all this debate about rules and discretion. The monetarists were attacking the Keynesians that, fiscal policy isn't going to work because there are time lags and implementation and design, and the politics gets in the way, you can't respond quickly enough, blah, blah. Well, under a job guarantee, you just have an unconditional job offer at the job guarantee office, and any worker who walks in on any day can get a job at a social inclusive minimum wage and be employed productively. And so that became automatic. And it also had excuse me, I'm just some water. It also had implications for the way conventional Keynesians were talking about stagflation, etc. And I characterise this as a sort of generalised expansion. Particularly, the government stimulates the economy through capital expenditure, which then has multiplier effects and the sort of things you learn in undergraduate macroeconomics. And what I understood at that period, and I still understand, is that a generalised expansion really doesn't have an inflation anchor to it. And yeah, it creates nice bridges and roads and public institutions, but it can't be a tool in a highly inflationary context that delivers you price stability and full employment. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, the inflation bias of the 1960s that John Cornwell identified was one of the reasons Keynesian economics floundered in the 70s. Some of the issues, types of jobs. Look, I don't want to talk about that. My research team has done lots of work, and we've come up hundreds of thousands, and we could scale it up to whatever size economy you like, to be millions of jobs that are highly creative, highly productive, highly suitable. And one of the elements of suitability is the ephemeral nature of the jobs. It's got to be a buffer stock, in and out. And some jobs then won't be very suitable to that because you want that service provided continuously. But we've got research that we can come up with any number of jobs that can be ephemeral, that are productive, that are important. The other, and within that, the other element is that I remember giving a talk to a bunch of Marxists in the 80s or something. No, in the 90s maybe. And, you know, the accusation coming from my peers then was that this is just a band-aid for capitalism. And, you know, we've got to, and so my response to them was, oh, right, so we've got to, while we're young academics getting with a stable job, getting a nice salary, pontificating about how we're going to overthrow the capitalist system by creating long-term mass unemployment among the plebs. Is that what we're talking about here? You know, because that's really what they're on about. And at that time, I knew that I would rather delay the revolution and have everybody working in a secure job that gave them some dignity and didn't incur all of those costs of unemployment than sit around and do nothing. So I rejected all of that. But what is important is that the job guarantee can be a vehicle to broaden our concept of productivity into social concepts. And this is my surfer musician type model, where we redefine productivity away from the gainful worker concept, which emerged in the 1930s, where productivity, essentially you're productive if you contributed to the capitalist bottom line. Well, I think you're productive if you contribute to the social bottom line. And I think having surfers on the job guarantee, surfing, but in between times teaching children about water safety. This last summer just gone in Australia, we had a lot of drownings. That's incredibly productive. And if we had poets on job guarantee, teaching children the beauty of words and phrasing and evoking deep emotion and softening society and becoming more together, that's incredibly productive. And so I think the job guarantee provides a vehicle by the design of the jobs and the sort of jobs that you include in the job guarantee to configure societal notions. All right, so the last thing, 2 minutes, the last thing I'll say is that is a job guarantee going to solve the current inflationary problem? Answer, no. And the reason is that it would, but to do so would be incredibly destructive. In the same way that trying to solve it with any demand side contraction whether it be monetary policy or fiscal policy, and we can debate the effectiveness of both, but that's not the point, would be incredibly destructive. It's not going to solve the causes of the problem. The inflation of the 1970s was propagated by the wage price conflict. Yeah, there was an initial supply shock, but that was then pushed forward and sustained independently of that shock by the capital-labour conflict. Well, that's not a case anymore. Trade unions have been devastated. Workers are unable now to resist the real wage cuts and real income cuts that are occurring. And the inflation, I keep saying it's transitory. And everyone says, oh yeah, you've been saying that for a year and a half. Well, I have, but transitory doesn't have a temporal element. It has a causation element. And the pandemic might go on for 15 years, who knows? The war in Ukraine might go on for indefinite period. And OPEC might continue to take profits and hold back supply. And but that's not going to be addressed by demand type contractions of the type that during a wage price spiral, a job guarantee would directly address. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have a job guarantee. That's the base level framework in my view. But for those who say, oh yeah, the job guarantee will solve the inflation problem, it won't. And to try to use it in that way, in other words, to redistribute workers into a job guarantee pool would be a very ineffective way to see out this current transitory period of inflationary pressures. So that's it. Neither of the two buffer stocks are very desirable, but one is superior by far and addresses the dreadful costs of the other and provides in a more optimistic way a pathway to future conceptions of evaluations of what type of work is work and meaningful and productive. And for some workers, a job guarantee would be their permanent job. And it would be incredibly productive and rewarding to those workers, because during the full employment period of after the Second World War, the private sector didn't employ everybody. A lot of governments ran implicit buffer stock employment schemes to soak up the really hard to employ, the workers with mental illnesses, the workers with criminal tendencies who are in and out of the system, and other people with just short-term employment needs. And so there would be some job guarantee pool permanently, but it would probably be, the aim is to make it relatively small. All right, so I think we've got about 20 minutes to go, and I'm quite happy just to sit here now and take questions from the floor. And I think someone presumably is going to type these questions in for me, or I can hear them.
Hi, Professor Mitchell. Thank you for the talk. I was just asking if you foresee any issues in a government that has high levels of foreign denominated debt in implementing this approach.
Well, a government with high levels of foreign denominated debt is in trouble implementing any approach. And a government with high levels of foreign denominated debt should do all it can over time. And I know that for many nations that's very difficult, but they should be trying to work a way not to rely on foreign currency denominated debt. But there's no particular problems, in my view, for a poorer country introducing a job guarantee program. I mean, when you think about it, they're not the investment required is not very large relative to how much they're probably spending on defence expenditure or other sorts of things that the IMF think they should spend on. So look, foreign currency debt to a nation's a problem, but it's not a specific problem in implementing social reform, and it's not a specific problem in implementing a job guarantee. And in a way, a job guarantee structure allows them to address, in some ways, their poverty traps and improve the local market that then attracts foreign direct investment that can be conducive to further growth. So that'd be my answer. I mean, it's not a specific problem.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture. My question is the following, and I want your ideas. Do you have faith in the ability of the epistemic community of economists to learn from its mistakes, revise fundamental assumptions and tenets of the policy paradigm? Or do you think it's a far more political process, like some kind of a trench war that we have to fight, and in order to change the objectives and key ideas that regarding macroeconomics? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Good. That's an excellent question. When I studied philosophy of science, and it wasn't long after Thomas Kuhn had brought his book out, and so I'm a student of the 70s and early 80s. And at that stage, there were huge debates about epistemic debates with Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, and then Imre Lakatos produced his fantastic stuff in the early 70s. And so I was caught up in all of that debate about paradigm shift and what are paradigms and under what conditions do paradigms persist and under what conditions do they fall. And what I learned from that is, and if you then study disciplines across the spectrum, you learn that paradigm shift is very slow. And, I also became very keen on the social psychology of Irvin Janis, and who developed the groupthink idea. And what you understand then is that what Imre Lakatos said were degenerative paradigms that had lost any real capacity to be congruent with empirical facts. They can hang on for years. And the example I use is neurogenesis. The classic neurogenesis, classic clinical psychology was that if you had a brain injury, you could never, that was it. And all clinical practice was predicated on the assumption that if you injured your brain, you were permanently injured. And a PhD student in 1962, and all the senior professors had built careers on that notion. And a young PhD student in 1962 came up with the idea of neurogenesis, that your brain can actually heal itself somewhat. And he was sort of marched out of the town. And that research didn't bind. And then for the next 2 or 3 decades, the empirical dissonance in that area of academic practice became greater and greater. And what do I mean by that? Well, doctors started to observe people's brains in repairing themselves after a major traumatic injury. And it wasn't really until 1995, I think, where the second major neurogenesis paper came out that caused the paradigm to shift. And along the way, of course, Max Planck, the German physicist, says, paradigm shift one funeral at a time. And what he was referring, he didn't say that actually, that's paraphrasing what he said. But the intent was that, senior professors like me, we've got a vested interest in preserving our reputations. And if we're one-trick ponies, if we're just monetarists, or new Keynesians these days, even worse, and we're one-trick ponies, and that's our salary and our repute and the invitations to all of the, as guest speakers, to all these sort of events and stuff, and access to grant money and privilege and all the rest of it. Well, we're going to be very resistant when a young buck PhD student comes along and says you're wrong. Now, obviously, the progressive thing to do is to accept you're wrong and to embrace the new knowledge and proceed, but that's not the way the system particularly works. And so you get this massive resistance and denial of facts. A mob rule emerges, and it conditions, who gets accepted for publications, who gets research grants, who gets appointed, who gets promoted. And very few people, say like me, who have been opposed to all of the mainstream forever, very few people like me get through to senior levels of the academy under those circumstances. Mavericks and apostates very rarely succeed. And I put it down to the fact that of my mathematics and econometrics, I was able to slither through some way. But so the answer to your question is no, I don't think it's still not going to happen anytime soon. When I hear MMTers say we've won, that's nonsensical. We haven't won until all the senior professors are like me and Randy and Pavlina, MMTers, and the textbooks are MMT textbooks. That's when we've won, but we're a long way away from that. It's depressing, isn't it? Yeah. But we've been at it for 25 years, so hang in there. Next question.
Could you discuss a little more about how you think the individualized approach to the job guarantee would play out and how that might contrast with state and national goals to build infrastructure and create other types of public goods?
I'm not sure what you mean by an individualized approach.
Well, I'm saying the suitability criteria in the conception of the jobs guarantee that you described.
What type of jobs are you talking about?
I'm saying, so the example you gave was surfers and sort of finding jobs immediately adjacent to, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, bear in mind that that was my extreme example of how far you could push the concept of productive work. It's out there. That's that example. But look, there's a massive number of opportunities in areas of unmet need, both say environmental care and community need, that a private market will never satisfy because it's unprofitable according to private calculus. And so whenever you've got an area where there's social gain possible, but the private calculus won't allocate resources, well, then you've got space for job guarantee activity. And I mean, one of the other criticisms of it has been that, oh, it'll just undermine the current labour market, you know. So the design of the jobs has to be that you don't just it's not a substitution exercise, and it should never be a vehicle for undermining existing conditions in the conventional public service. Now, I understand that any government can come along and corrupt any good policy framework for evil, malevolent ends, but you know, that's a separate argument. And so the question then is, well, what jobs do you want to sequester to be the job guarantee jobs that are not going to, and what jobs do you want to have as conventional public service jobs? And well, that's a case-by-case analysis, and it's also a nation-by-nation analysis. So, you know, some years ago, I did work on the expanded public works program in South Africa, which is sort of like a guaranteed number of hours type program. It wasn't an unconditional guarantee. And I was working with civil engineers who understood road building. And so, you know, for that nation, it became very appropriate for this program to be allocating these workers to road building, very labour intensive road gangs. And I remember, you know, the engineers South African engineers who had done their PhDs at MIT and the IMF, and they were all saying, this is outrageously inefficient. You know, and I remember at a meeting in Pretoria, the guy said to me, oh, you wouldn't build roads like this in Australia. And I said to him that in 1950s, we built them exactly like that. We wouldn't do it now because we've evolved beyond the stage of development. And so we have capital intensive techniques now, but in some phases of development, it's totally appropriate to build roads. And what this civil engineer guy I was working with did research on showing that the quality of the tarmac was exactly the same as using big capital machinery. But so it's a case-by-case analysis as to what the jobs will be and what the labour capital ratios will be. And in some cases, you know, we wouldn't, in Australia and the US, you wouldn't have road building as a job guarantee job, I don't think. But in some very poor countries, it may be an absolutely brilliant way to provide job security and income growth to workers. I hope that sort of addresses your question. Probably time for one more, or whatever I'm in your hands.
We could do one more. Yeah. One last question.
Okay, Bill, I think we're done. They've got a field trip.
Oh, okay.
Thanks a lot.
No worries. Well, I'll see you all tomorrow. Take care.
Yep, thanks.